Today, we're going to be talking about treaty ports and missionaries. This is really interesting because when you think of a treaty port, it has a connotation that you lost some sort of war and you are now required to open a port. That's a treaty port, yes?
Yes.
So how does that apply to Taiwan?
Okay. After the Opium War, China had to open up 5 ports to trade.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation.
Formosa Files.
Those 5 ports were on mainland China, 2 of them across from Taiwan, Fuzhou and Xiamen, or Amoy as it was called at the time.
So the ports that were being forced open in Taiwan are connected to the Opium War?
There are 2 Opium Wars. The first one is 1839 through to 1842, and the second one, 1856 through to 1860. So that is the one that opened up ports in Taiwan. 4 ports in total, 2 main ones, Anping, Tainan, and Danshui up near Taipei, and then 2 secondary ports, Keelung and Kaohsiung.
1860 would be right about when America was getting into its Civil War.
Yes, it was on the cards. Fighting hadn't kicked off yet. Yes, that would start the next year, I think.
1861, right.
So Taiwan wasn't directly involved in the Opium Wars, but indirectly, there's an interesting incident. Have you heard of 2 shipwrecks, the Nebuda and the Anne?
No.
Okay. 2 ships during the first Opium War. The Nebuda shipwrecked near Keelung in late 41, and then the Anne near Taichung in 1842. These were transport ships transporting mostly Indian sailors.
And these sailors were on their way to China to fight in the Opium War.
Yes. The survivors were marched down to Tainan, and on August 10th, they were executed. Well, a lot of them, 197 of them. An additional 87 died from illness and ill treatment in captivity. Just 11 survivors. 11 survivors. Horrible.
So that was the major action that took place in Taiwan related to the Opium Wars as far as fighting goes. So executed by the Qing authorities on Taiwan because they were part of the Qing Empire, even though there was no direct fighting on Taiwan in either of the Opium Wars.
Yes.
So, what did the British do after they lost their troops?
But normally you'd expect in these days of gunboat diplomacy and just general gunboat everything for some warships to have turned up and blasted the hell out of this.
Definitely.
But no, the war ended 2 weeks after the executions. And by the time the Brits found out about it, they signed all the paperwork and were glad that everything had wrapped up. They weren't looking to reignite a war which had already dragged on.
So the British wanted to trade opium with China, but that would be China proper. What would be the point of having treaty ports in Taiwan? What were they trying to export? What did the Westerners want?
Well, there wasn't actually that much that they couldn't have got elsewhere, but just general trade, I guess. Opium was was popular, and they were getting sugar and rice and peanut oil at that time, major exports from Taiwan.
Sugar seems to be one that's been popular for a long time here.
It's the main export through the 19th century, except for the end. Tea took over in the last few decades of the 19th century.
What type of tea?
Oolong tea.
Okay.
How do you describe that to folks that aren't familiar with it?
It's a kind of black tea, is it not?
Yeah, sort of it's in between the green and the black.
So that became popular in both America and Europe?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't come across oolong tea when I was in New Zealand until I came here. And yeah, surprised to know that the Americans had a taste for it in the 1800s. So almost all going to the US. And it was a Scottish chap who came here, when the treaty ports were opened in Danshui, came across some tea plants, thought it had a lot of potential and encouraged production here, processing. And this chap, John Dodd, really helped the tea industry take off, absolutely boomed. And like I said, it was the main export from Taiwan in those last decades of the 1800s. And it's oolong tea, and for American drinkers.
So
surprising, right?
Yeah, it is. The British were getting their tea from India.
Yeah, Sri Lanka, India, yeah.
Okay, so this is an unknown little fact here. Americans near the Civil War time were into oolong tea from Taiwan.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the this idea of treaty ports. So what did a treaty port get you? When you signed these documents and China opened up these things, what were the British and I suppose various other nationalities, what were they allowed to do?
Okay, so a treaty port gives you the right to trade, of course, and residence, and so you lease land, and also missionaries given freedom to preach, not just in the treaty port area, but all over China.
So first come some traders, then come a variety of other foreigners for whatever reasons, and then definitely the missionaries.
Yes.
And of both Protestant and Catholic denominations.
That's right. There were some Catholics down in your area, Kaohsiung.
Yeah, I think the oldest basilica is down here in Kaohsiung. What was that, somewhere around 1860?
That's right.
Yeah, it's still here.
And Presbyterians also came in the 1860s, setting up in Tainan. But the most memorable missionary is from the 1870s, up in the north, Danshui, George Mackay. Everyone knows him here, a household name on the island. And yeah, he came out in 1872. He was the first missionary for a couple of hundred years. The last time was with the Spanish and Dutch. So it's a while. And it wasn't easy for him, but he was a spirited preacher. So he set himself to the task and made tremendous progress. Yes.
And he's famous for not only hanging out in Danshui, but he went all over the East Coast in the north there and even went over to what were then headhunting tribes.
Yes, he traveled a lot, setting up chapels and just spreading the word and pulling teeth as he went.
Right. This is actually what made him popular in Taiwan, his ability to pull teeth. Let's talk about this for a second. So dentistry back in the day was take a big stone and maybe bang real hard and see if you can knock out one of your teeth that's just giving you way too much pain. Something along that lines. And Mackay comes along and he's got modern, or for that time, modern tools.
Well, that's a pretty reasonable assumption, Eric. But no, in his book, From Far Formosa, he mentions that the dental tools he had were pretty primitive. He got a local blacksmith to make them.
So pliers we're talking about here.
We're talking about mechanical dentistry, but apparently did the job. I think it was mostly pulling teeth, not much else. No fillings.
Yeah. And you can imagine that the teeth of local people back then were probably in quite sad shape. We still have a betel nut eating tradition here, but I'm sure it was even more popular back then.
Yes, very much so. And yeah, I mean, he was pulling so many teeth so quickly. He'd have people line up and they're standing, no time for sitting, and he'd just go through them, one after the other, pulling out the teeth. I think he calculated roughly how many teeth he'd pulled out. In his book, he says 21,000 extractions to his credit.
Okay, so for me, if I had just had my tooth pulled out with pliers, I don't think I would be very open to listening to the gospel. But apparently, it was a relatively decent opening for him. As soon as he finished, he was able to preach and sing hymns and make some converts.
Yes, I think people's teeth were in worse conditions than what yours would be when you finally head to the dentist. So he says that the relief from the pain they had was almost immediate. And then they were, okay, you can preach now. So after his tooth pulling, he would tell them about the blessings of Christianity.
What you said is interesting. If you had that much pain, we all know what a toothache is like. I mean, really, it's a pain like no other. And to have that relieved is heavenly.
Yes. Another key to his success was simple localization. He taught Taiwanese preachers, and he was big on translation into local language, Taiwanese, Romanized.
So I'm assuming he spoke Taiwanese.
Oh, yeah, yes. So when he turned up, no need to learn Chinese yet. He just learned Taiwanese from the locals. After 6 months, of intensive study, he was preaching.
Impressive.
Part of his idea of being local and doing things in a local way was married a local woman.
I think we've done that as well.
Yes. How's your civilizing mission going, Eric?
It's actually gone the other way. She's civilized me.
Yes.
But I'm assuming not everybody was fond of being preached to or this attempted conversion. There's never a story that I know of missionaries where everyone's happy with them.
No, he got a lot of abuse, things thrown at him, stones, fruit. He was run out of town. Converts were persecuted.
Wasn't there a famous case where a convert was like beheaded and they carried the heads in buckets?
Okay, so Eric, do you know Bangka?
Bangka is the Taiwanese term for a place in Taipei we now call Wanhua, and today it's a district of Taipei City. And back in the day, though, in Mackay's time, it would have been like a mini city up there.
Yes, it was quite big at the time. So, yeah, I mean, he mentions having a very difficult time there, and he drew a lot of hostility from local leaders. He mentions 8 converts being framed and falsely accused of trying to assassinate a Mandarin, and they were kept in stocks in a dungeon, tortured, had mock trials, taken down to Tainan and imprisoned. 2 of the converts, a teacher and a father, were dragged out and beheaded, and the father was forced to see his son's head hacked off. 2 heads put in buckets, labeled heads of the Christians, and carried back to Bangka. I mean, that's a long trip, isn't it?
It is, and it was very clear why they were doing it. They were trying to send a message.
Yeah, that's a 2-week trip. So along the way, villagers are summoned to come out and see what happens to those who follow the barbarian, and the heads were put on the city gates back in Bangka. Yeah.
So this was done with the permission of the Qing authorities?
Yeah.
Huh. They weren't very appreciative for his tooth-pulling efforts.
That's right. Bad stuff, but it has a happy ending. Decades later, he gets a hero send-off when he goes home to Canada for some leave. This is about 20 years later, and the townspeople put out music bands. Officials came out. They carried Mackay around in a sedan chair, and really laid out a big event for him, showing their respect for what he had done. So from those early days to respected person later on.
And then, of course, he returned to Taiwan and then spent the rest of his life here, and he's buried here.
Yes. And although I don't support taking chopped off heads on week-long tours of islands, no. I must say that Mackay did bring some hostility upon himself, quite aggressive in his missionary work at times.
Oh.
Preaching from nearby temples, basically on the steps of temples.
that is a little
not a
aggressive.
Good move. Having your newly converted Christians burning idols.
Yeah, it's pushing it a bit, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, he did the school, first girls' school too.
So today, as John noted earlier, he is a household name in Taiwan. There's a statue of him in Danshui. There's a couple hospitals named after him. He's seen now as a bringer of medical mercy.
Absolutely. Yes. Great stuff. I love those early treaty port decades. You had a free hand doing things, You
were pretty much allowed to do what you wanted as a Westerner in a treaty port.
And also the officials, the Qing officials being so far away from Beijing, also just the distance of being at the edge of a frontier. It's quite different.
Right. So we've got to remember that there's no way of making a quick phone call up to Beijing. To get any message across would have taken anywhere from weeks to heaven knows how long.
Yeah, this is the end of the world. This is remote. Just always got to remember that.
So to finish up the story of Mackay real quick, he died in 1901 in Taiwan.
Yeah, and buried here in Danshui.
And as you noted, he set up hospitals. Oxford College is the first modern school in Taiwan. It was called that. And the first girls' school as well. So today he has quite an impressive reputation. But if we look at missionaries in general, what was the attitude of of the traders and the military people and the other foreigners in these treaty ports, how did they view missionaries?
Well, it was a mixed bag. You think they would be on the same team and quite supportive of one another, but not so. In general, the other foreigners didn't like missionaries. They looked down on them. We have to first think about who are the other foreigners in the treaty port. Okay, you might have a consul, British consul, a representative from the government, and they were highly educated people who had passed difficult exams and what have you to get these positions. They thought missionaries were kind of lower class and not people they would normally associate with in polite society.
But they were also a little upset about the whole stirring things up. Like you mentioned him preaching on a temple step. That would be something that a diplomat would not want to happen on his turf.
Yes, that was the main point. That was the main problem. That the consul was there to protect the rights of foreigners, but also to make sure that foreigners didn't stir things up. And missionaries stirred things up directly with their preaching, but also by when they were successful and people converted to Christianity, it just upset the local society. It brought change and problems sometimes. And then for other foreigners, they kind of didn't like missionaries preaching about not drinking too much, not gambling, and not taking in housemaids, shall we say.
You're talking about women who might do more than just housework.
Temporary wives, shall we say. It was quite common.
Right. So the missionaries would rail against these vices to the local people, and the foreigners would be like, "Hey, you're you're messing with my fun time here."
Exactly. Yes.
I see. So a little bit of a rocky relationship between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So we pointed out one of the most famous missionary of that time. But let's now go over and talk about one of the outstanding individuals on the other side of the fence, on the trade side.
Okay. So William Pickering. Okay. If you had been in Treaty Port, Taiwan, in let's say the late 1860s, then you'd probably meet, if you're meeting a foreigner, someone who worked for the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service. When I say imperial, I don't mean the British Empire. I actually mean the Qing.
Okay.
So these are foreigners working for the Qing government, for the emperor. They are keeping a close eye on trade. All the ships that come in, they check the cargo, they see that it's been correctly labeled and counted, and they're imposing tariffs, taking the tax money. About half of them were British, and the foreigners, that is, and the others, Americans, Germans, what have you. Also some Chinese, but not in the senior positions. So
was this a face-saving deal for the Chinese to allow foreigners to oversee this, or was this something that organically evolved?
This is a result of the Opium Wars, one of the regulations, but the Chinese were happy to go along with it because it ensured a more honest collection of taxes for them. Right.
Okay, so there was something in it for them. They got more tax revenue and less corruption.
Yeah, but the local officials didn't like it.
Obviously, right.
So one of the most colorful of these customs service people who came to Taiwan was William Pickering. He'd gone to sea when he was a teenager, and after about 6 years of sailing around the world, he went ashore, joined the maritime customs in Fujian, and then in 1963 he came over to Kaohsiung and then up to Anping. Later he went into trade, working for a trade company, and all sorts of adventures.
He's 22 years old, and he's in charge of basically all trade coming into Anping.
A couple of years older, but yeah, he's in mid-20s, and you're running the show. Not bad, eh?
Yeah, and he got famous for being quite the traveler around Taiwan.
Yes, he made trips into the interior, visiting indigenous areas, and he was involved with some shipwrecks, trying to find survivors or bones of survivors, helping with treaties. And then he got involved in something called the Camphor War. He was with a private company that was trying to work around the country's camphor monopoly, the government monopoly on camphor. Ended up with shots being fired. Him on the run. He had a bounty on his head. The British sent in some gunships to Anping, actually had troops secure the port with loss of life on the Qing side. 2 years after the Camphor War, Pickering going on the run, and the gunboats managed to get the bounty lifted off Pickering's head. But the authorities had it in for him. And also he became quite sick, chronic dysentery, and he went back home 1870. Not unusual to leave after getting sick, though. Typically, it would be malaria. So Mackay says he almost died from malaria, and he called it the blackest foe that hangs longest over our beautiful island, and that it was not uncommon, he says, when he visited towns to find about half the people down with malarial fever.
And this is when the Europeans did not yet know that mosquitoes were part of the connection, right? They didn't know that mosquitoes carried malaria.
No, they still thought it was bad air.
They thought it was some sort of poisonous vapor from decaying vegetation. So they would stay away from places that looked like they were bogs or had vapors. But it took a while for them to figure out the mosquito connection.
Yes, and part of that discovery was from someone who came out to Kaohsiung, working for the Chinese Maritime Imperial Customs, a Scot by the name of Patrick Manson. He was just 22. Oh, it makes me sick seeing all these guys have great adventures and doing important things at such an early age. Eh?
Are you having a little nostalgia attack here?
Yes,
pining for your youth?
Yes. So he got a job in Kaohsiung. It was a hardship posting. It's maybe one of the reasons that we're getting such young men being sent there. It wasn't the choicest place to be sent to. So for Patrick Manson, his first place, Kaohsiung, and he would later go to Amoy, to Xiamen, across the strait. And while he was there, he continued on his experiments and his work with tropical diseases, and he discovered that mosquitoes were a host for a parasitic worm for some disease that I don't know how to pronounce.
Interesting. So almost assuredly, he gave a lot of thought to the whole malaria problem while he was in Kaohsiung.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so interesting. Today we've been talking about two groups of Westerners who lived in what were called treaty ports, 4 of them in Taiwan, and they were sort of self-governing little enclaves of foreign trade and missionary work. You were allowed to preach to the natives, which was done with varying degrees of fervor. And the legacy of the missionary work is interesting. Most Aboriginal people, most indigenous people in Taiwan, generally say that they belong to one of the Christian denominations. So in that respect, they were very successful in converting the Aboriginals or indigenous people. But in general, you wouldn't be able to say that they really Christianized Taiwan, would you?
No. What would the number of Christians be in Taiwan?
Something like 4%.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. And of that, it's like roughly half Catholic, half Protestant. And of course, Protestant divides into so many various groups but the biggest one would be Presbyterians.
Yes. And Presbyterians have had an influence on the political development of Taiwan.
Very much so. The president who started the democratic process that led to the Taiwan we live in today, his name was Lee Teng-hui. He was a Presbyterian and very devout.
Lay preacher, if I remember rightly.
That's right. Yeah. In general, I think it's very fair to say that having the Christians and the missionaries come in led Taiwan to be a much more open society when it comes to religion. Today in Taiwan, we have almost zero religious strife.
Yes, religious freedom here is fantastic. It's probably the thing I would point out to as its shining star. It's wonderful.
You'll see Christians marrying Taoists or a Buddhist marrying a Catholic, and the two families won't necessarily protest.
Exactly. And there's no bad feeling for those who are not religious.
What about the trading side before we close here? What was the legacy of the treaty port trading? We talked about the legacy of religion. What about the trading?
Well, developing the economy for export, and that is quite consistent through time. Through the Japanese period, they're exporting to Japan. So yes, outward-looking, dynamic traders, still like that today.
This has been Formosa Files. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
You can reach us at formosafiles@gmail.com if you want to leave a comment or a suggestion. Coming up soon, shipwrecks, if I'm not mistaken. And this is more than just a shipwreck. Well, this is a really fascinating story. This is the story of when America invaded Taiwan. How's that for a teaser?
Yes. Spoiler alert, they lost.
Hey, okay. Well, we're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.